Good morning and welcome to EMPA's October 2023 webinar. I would like to begin this webinar by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders and their connections to land, sea and community. And we'd like to extend respect to all the Pacific Island, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm joining you today from Naarm in Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. My name is David Bruce. I'm the Communications Director for Natural Hazards Research Australia, and I welcome everybody. Today's webinar continues a very long tradition. It's vital that we learn from our collective experience of natural hazards. This enables us to improve our planning and policies for future events based upon the direct experiences of communities. This is the base of scientific evidence that helps us plan for a safer future. And for many years, the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC conducted post-event research that began around the 2009 Black Saturday fires and went right up to the Black Summer fires of 2019-2020. There's an enormous body of research available, free and online, and this provides insights into the how and the why and the what now of some of Australia's most significant natural hazards. Today's webinar is the latest in a tradition of the NHRA Research, community experiences before and after the flood. Now, there's a lot of fire activity around the country at the moment, but we remember not very long ago, the devastating floods from February to July 2022, where they affected more than 80 local government areas across New South Wales and across Queensland and caused widespread trauma and devastation. Many communities were affected actually multiple times. Researchers from 3 universities were engaged by Natural Hazards Research Australia to explore the experiences of these communities before, during and after these floods. We know that agencies are already using this research. This demonstrates its value in informing our warning systems, our emergency plans, where future capability is required, and how EM managers, government and policymakers can better engage with communities in the future. The research highlights the role that communities play in a major natural hazard event. The research team used one prompt: tell us about your flood story. The resulting volume of data contains many gems for us communicators and all engagement specialists across Australia. Here's the report that they produced, if you can see it on my camera. That doesn't quite come out with my, there it is. It's online at the moment. At the end of the presentation, you'll see a website where you can see the report. There's a summary report, a full report, and there's a 4-page hazard note briefing paper. And there's videos and there's PowerPoint presentations there. So all the information from the presentation today is available at that website, which we'll give later. There's also ongoing research into the floods in Tasmania and Victoria and South Australia that happened at the end of last year. You'll hear more about these at a later date. But today, we're going to hear from our lead researcher into the New South Wales and Queensland floods, Dr. Mel Taylor. Mel will answer questions provided by some of the early bird registrants and the ones that you'll now ask in the Q&A panel. To introduce Mel, Mel's an occupational psychologist and an honorary associate professor at Macquarie University. Her research focuses on human behaviour in natural hazards emergencies, terrorism and emergency animal diseases. Most recently, Mel has been leading this Natural Hazards Research Australia research into the flooding in New South Wales and Queensland. Welcome, Mel. Over to you.
Thanks very much, David. I'm just going to share my screen, get it up. Okay, so thank you, everybody. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land I'm coming to you today, which is the lands of the Darug people. I'd also like to thank EMPA for inviting me to do this webinar today and to all of you for attending. And good morning to those of you in Australia and afternoon to those in New Zealand who might be with us. On this first slide, I just really would like to make a few acknowledgements as well. You've already heard that there were 3 universities involved in this research. It was a large project. I couldn't possibly have done that alone. So I just really would like to acknowledge my colleagues here who are on the screen and those others who have participated in the research. So I would also like to thank the end users for this research. So we were supported throughout by New South Wales SES and Queensland Fire Emergency Services, who were supporting this research and advising and guiding us through it. I'd like to thank NHRA as well for their support of this research, especially the media team who helped get get sort of participants to take part in this. And of course, my immense thanks go to those people who did participate in the research and those who provide us with photographs. So hopefully you'll see through this presentation, there are some photographs which we've been given by participants, and they've really helped to sort of add some value and some meaning to some of the presentations that I've been able to give. So here's a quick overview of the plan for today. So I'm going to do a very quick catch up really on the methodology. I won't sort of dwell on that too long, but there's a few key things I need to say there and remind people of to when it comes to actually interpreting the information that I'm going to provide. As David said, we asked for questions and we had loads and loads of them, which were fantastic. And Barbara Ryan, who was also on the project team here, she did a great job of doing a bit of pre-selection, and then I've been able to sort of take a few of those to actually go and talk a bit more on today. Some of the questions were, all the questions were great, but some of them were a little bit above my pay grade, I'm afraid, so I couldn't take those ones. So I've tried to focus on some of the ones I think I can give a bit more insight into. And then, as David said, we're going to have a few breaks along the way, and I'm really keen to not only hear new questions, but also get your comments about some of the things I've said, if they gel with you, or perhaps if they don't sort of gel, I'd like to know a bit more about that. So I would really encourage you to sort of write a few comments as well as the questions too. And we'll hopefully have a bit of time at the end for any additional questions, and I'll do my best to answer some of those. So first, I'd like to just recap the methodology we used. And as David said, we've used the methodology that's been used consistently in Australia post-event. So I've been involved in post-bushfire research where we've used both qualitative interviews with people who've been through have been threatened by fires, in this case from floods, and also then follow on with the survey, an online survey where anybody who's been impacted in that same sort of time frame can jump in and add their views as well. So mixed methods, these are really complementary sort of sets of data. So the interviews, as you would expect, have a lot of detail, a lot of those big quotes that we can use. You really get an understanding of some of the situations and the complexities that people are facing. And in the survey, we get that quantitative data where we get perhaps a bit more of a representative view of a broader set of experiences there that we can draw on, and of course we can do statistical analysis and dig down into the data a bit further. And I guess today I just want to sort of come clean, I guess, and say I am relying a bit more on some of the quantitative data today in giving some of those responses to the questions. In the interviews we did face-to-face, as you can see in the photograph here. So that's Maddie and our team talking to one of our lovely participants who was very happy to be on the photograph and have us use that down in Woodburn. So we did the face-to-face field work, but we also did interviews on Zoom and on the phone with some people, depending on their preferences. And the survey, I said, was all online. The approach we take is very much trauma-informed. So as David has already said, we ask people to tell us about their experiences and we let them talk. We let them tell us about the things that matter, the things that were salient to them. We do have questions we want to ask, but we don't impose those at the outset. We kind of will come back to those if they haven't covered them, or we'll ask questions if there are gaps or people are asking us to sort of for feedback about whether they're sort of talking about the right sorts of things that we're interested in. So it's very much driven by the participants, and of course that in itself means that there are a few things here that are important. So in particular, things like timing. So here you can see on the slide information about the data that we collected. So when it comes to the interviews, we were in the field in mid-August towards the end of October, and majority of the participants were impacted by the floods that occurred in the end of February, early March. So for those people, it was about 5 to 7 months down the track for them. So, they'd been through the experiences of the flood, but they were also managing a lot of that sort of early recovery stage as well. And so some of the issues they were having there were much more salient. So they talked a lot about those sorts of issues as well. Those people who were impacted by the flooding in July, down perhaps more around my way in the Hawkesbury area, for some of those people, it could have been as little as a couple of months after the event. So, some different sorts of experiences there that they were drawing on. The other thing that is, of course, important here is that you can see where we've covered in the locations we covered with the interviews there in that map on the left-hand side. But what we're covering there is a whole heap of different experiences. So you've got the flood experiences you will have seen in the media, Lismore and around the Northern Rivers, where people had incredibly dangerous and high levels of flood water, being plucked off their roofs. But we also had people, on the Central Coast, for example, near me, where there were extreme floods, but they weren't as extreme as you'd seen on the media, and they were things that people were dealing with. The same out to the west in Warwick and other areas out there. There were a whole mix of experiences, and it wasn't just about floodwater in homes. It was about people being isolated on flood islands. It was about people impacted by landslides and other sorts of events as well that occurred as part of the flooding. So in terms of our team, the Queensland team focused on those interviews in Queensland. So we have a lot of interviews occurred in the suburbs in and around Brisbane, which don't really show up too well on the map, but we did have a lot of interviews with people in those suburbs around the Brisbane area, out towards Warwick, and both teams went out north to Gympie and Maryborough and did on-the-ground fieldwork up there. In our Macquarie-based New South Wales team, we focused on the Northern Rivers for our fieldwork. Again, we were guided by New South Wales SES, where they wanted us to focus. So we did a lot of work in the Northern Rivers area, but also, as you can see there, around the Hunter, the Hawkesbury, Central Coast, down to Woronora and places like that around Sydney. So, and in those areas, some people had been impacted by flooding 4 or 5 times in the last 15 or so months before we actually spoke to them. So lots of multiple floods in those areas. We did 192 interviews in total, 100 in New South Wales and 92 in Queensland. So a lot of qualitative data. And in the interviews, in the survey, we've got 430 responses, which doesn't perhaps sound like a lot of responses, but very, very detailed information there about everything from prior exposure to flooding through to those early stages of recovery and future plans that people might have. The survey took place in November through to February. You'll appreciate there that Christmas, New Year's in the middle of that. So a lot of the data was collected in November and in February, so sort of between 9 to 11 months after the flooding for those people who were impacted by the February, March floods. In terms of reporting, we've got a number of reports available on the website that you can see there. And as you will probably appreciate with Natural Hazards Research Australia, they're looking for information and research outcomes that can be used by policymakers and those in practice and operational people. So a lot of the work we did in the write-up was to really focus on some of those policy relevant sort of content. And hopefully I'm going to drill down a bit more in that today. Okay, so heading over to some of the questions. So what we've done today is divide this into 6 chunks, if you like, and as you will have heard, we're going to have a break after the first 2 and maybe take some questions if there are some, or to deal with some of the comments that might have come up. So please have those questions in as I go through. Excuse me. I think one thing I want to try and remember to do as I go through as well is to just make a comment about some of those photographs. So this first question was about what the community's experiences were of emergency management, which again, you can appreciate is quite a broad question. And when I see this particular photograph, I think about the person who gave this photograph to me. And he was really interesting because he is terminally ill with cancer. So he is very much dependent on getting to hospital and healthcare. And in this case, up in the sort of Hunter Maitland area, he was on an isolated flood island and relied quite heavily on emergency management, New South Wales SES, who were operating a sort of a shuttle ferry on and off the island that he was on. And he was able to use that to get to a hospital appointment, which was great. So he was really grateful for that sort of that experience and that service from the SES. One of the issues he had, though, was that his appointment was late afternoon and these ferry shuttle sort of stopped at 4:30 in the afternoon. So he actually was in a situation where he got sort of caught on the other side after his hospital appointment. So, you know, a good experience, but a bit of a frustrating one as well. So what about other people's experiences of emergency management in these floods? Well, again, there's no single question, there's no single answer to that. You'll appreciate that. So what we found is, I guess in general sense, a really varied, mixed sort of view of this. And it depended, of course, on the sorts of experiences people had. You know, whether they'd been very minor, whether they'd been, you know, more extreme, the locations they were based in, because we have different sorts of flooding occurring in different areas, and of course the timing when we're asking people about their experiences, whether that was about the response phase of the flooding or whether it was into recovery. So, you know, unsurprisingly, we know that some people really felt very let down by the emergency management sort of fraternity here in terms of, you know, not having phone calls answered, not getting rescued. And so, of course, they were sort of, pretty down on the emergency management sort of system generally. But we also had a lot of people that were helped too. So, we had, I recall particularly, fireys were getting a lot of praise for the help that they had given people in cleaning out their homes afterwards and things like that. So a real mixed range there. So I thought about what data I've got that can help to sort of address this question. And I guess the indicators I've got in the survey are a couple of questions we asked. So we asked about trust in different groups in terms of information about the flooding. And we also asked about satisfaction with the support they'd received from various different parts of groups that they had come across. So what we found was that those people who'd had more sort of damage to their homes were generally had lower levels of trust in the emergency management organisations. So SES, other emergency services, local councils, who of course have a different role in Queensland in terms of more involvement in emergency preparedness. And we also include Bureau of Meteorology in this as well. And in terms of satisfaction, again, those people who had damage, who'd had sort of more sort of impacts, if you like, also tended to have lower levels of satisfaction. Again, it's really quite understandable. But I want to put this in context, and I'm very keen to do that from the outset and say that overall, I think the levels of trust in these organisations, as you can see on the slide there, is pretty high. You can see the overall balance there with, depending whether you're a glass half empty or glass half full person, depends whether you want to look at the left or the right, but on the right-hand side, you've got the higher levels of trust. So that sort of lighter blue and the yellow gives you a bit of a quick snippet of the levels of trust there. So you can see the Bureau of Meteorology, is highly trusted, and, SES and other service personnel are also up there too. A little more sort of mixed message, I think, there in the local council level, but we have a mix, of course, of Queensland, New South Wales in there too. And then in terms of support and the support people received from those organisations, or the similar ones I can pick from the question itself, you can see again we've got high levels of satisfaction on the right-hand side, so the lighter blue and the yellow. The fire service gets a big thumbs up in terms of flood, which seems a bit odd, but again, I know that a lot of help happened after the event in terms of and the local RFS members on the ground and up in Queensland too, who are able to help the community in some of that clear up. So a lot of different events there that were going on with emergency management. So moving on to the sort of second chunk of question, or second question here, was one about what did the public find the most effective method of communication from authorities during the crisis? So just unpacking that a little bit, we've got during the crisis. So I've tried to focus on during, and from authority. So this communication that they're getting from authority. And in terms of effective, of course, it depends on how you want to define effective. But for this, I've thought about what information I've got available that I can help to sort of address this question. So, effective communication, it could be about sort of alerting people to the event that's going to happen. It could be about the information that was sought and found and used by people, and also about what sort of preferences they have for the way they're communicated to. So what I've done is I've looked at those different elements to try and address this question. So starting off with alerting and early warning. So the first question we asked people in this area was, how did they first find out about the flooding, that they were going to be impacted by the flooding? So this is the data we've got on that sort of question. And people are going to give one response to this. So, how did you first find out? And you can see here on the graph that, the larger proportion there is saying that they observed this for themselves. They were tuned into the media, they had seen the rainfall, they knew it was extreme, they could see the rivers, they could understand how water was moving around on the land. We had a lot of people that really knew how to read their sort of environments, and so a lot of people found out for themselves really. But then you can see that after that there's not really a lot of difference between the other types of ways people found out about the flooding. So I know I've talked in previous presentations about the impacts and the value of the local connections. So people were finding out from friends and neighbours and being alerted by them, but you can see equally 10% were alerted by official messages from the emergency services and from the Bureau of Meteorology. So we've got all of those key organisations in there alerting people to these things. And just for completeness there in that other block, and quite a good proportion of those people there were saying that they didn't get any kind of advance warning. They weren't aware, no one contacted them, no one reached out. So, there are some mixed experiences in there too. In terms of how people received their official warnings, so we did ask about where they got the information from, and I've got this graph here, which is just giving you a bit of a breakdown of the responses from those people in New South Wales, which is in blue, those in Queensland in red, and the total population of our sample in the survey here in the green. And you can see, I guess, immediately that when we ask about the routes through which people received that sort of official SES warning messaging, a lot of people got that through SMS. And you can see there are differences there between New South Wales and Queensland in terms of the proportions. But I think the other thing to bear in mind here is a number of people we spoke to in interview said they did get SMS messages, but often they were too late. They didn't come in time for them to act. So, although those messages were getting through, in some cases, that was possibly a bit on the late side. And then if you look at the other groups there, you can see how people were receiving those official messages. So, ABC radio was being relied on by a large proportion of a relatively large proportion of people there. We've got door knocks occurring, and those others are everything from neighbours and local people sort of knocking on the door through to combinations of those sources. So I guess when we start thinking about the effective forms of communication here, that's giving you a bit more insight into how people receive that information. What about social media? I hear you ask, of course. And inevitably, you won't be surprised to know that people use a lot of social media during these flood events. And we asked them about what the most useful sources of information were on social media, and they could provide multiple sort of responses to this. But I think the point to get out of this is that 60% of the sample said that they were getting information from official sources through social media. So they were really using that social media channels as much as possible to sort of get that information. And we found older people in particular were looking more for official information on social media. Younger people were perhaps looking for more of that local content. So a little bit of a mix there in terms of the nuances, but really you can see that, again, social media was an important and an effective way for some of that information to get through. And then we asked people about how they would like to receive information in the future. So what are their preferences? Again, give you an indication of what they think is most effective for breaking through to them. And probably unsurprisingly, you'll see that a large proportion of our sample were saying we want that information through SMS, but a mix there as well on other things, apps and Facebook and social media, etc. So a mix there. But of course, I can hear already the yells from your desks about what the challenges are. And of course, again, pretty unsurprisingly obvious here. But even in good conditions, we found that almost 25% of the sample were saying they're already in black spots or places where the reception is poor. We had people that were having trouble accessing warnings during the floods, which was what this question was about, because they lost mobile phone connection, they had electricity outages. You can see almost 50% of people lost that connectivity. And of course, we appreciate that. If we're going to be relying on technology during these events for that information, that critical information, that we're going to really need to address some of those issues. And we know there's work underway there too. So I'm going to take a very quick break there and just give your ears a bit of a rest. And I'm going to pass to David and see if we've had any questions or comments come through. And before we just lose the screen for a second, I just thought this was an interesting picture. So this is the picture. The main photograph there is one that I took down in Lismore when we were there, of the rowing club, and I just was amazed at the time of the sort of the length or the height of that flood marker that's on the building. And then in preparing this presentation, I sort of came across the photograph. You can see the insert there on the bottom left, showing the same building, not during the main the higher floods that occurred in February. This is a second wave of flooding that occurred about 3-4 weeks later at the end of March, which was a massive setback for a few of the people we spoke to, because it washed away a lot of the stuff they were clearing up outside at the time, and it was very disruptive and obviously quite stressful. But you can see there, the height of the water on that building is hitting the sort of 11-meter mark just below the windows on the left-hand side there. Just thought it was a really interesting photograph. So David, have we got any comments or anything yet?
Thanks, Mel. Look, geez, a lot in that, what you're talking about there. The questions are starting to come through, and there's a lot of comments starting to come through as well. Probably won't read all the comments out because they're really good for you to look at later, Mel, and you can answer them in your own time later. And some of the questions are quite good too. The first question I've got is, you talked a bit about your methodology. You talked to a lot of people and you got a lot of data in your survey, and it's really rich there. Who did you need to get to? What parts of the community do you think you didn't tap into? Just to give some perspective of who was listened to and who maybe not have got a voice yet.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to say that this was all very much opt-in, and a lot of the media. No, I was going to say a lot of this was online, but that's not exactly true, because we did do quite a lot of local radio interviews for asking for people to take part. But I think inevitably we saw more people who were vocal about issues. Some of them had bugbears that they really wanted to get off their chest, and of course this gave them the opportunity to get that out of their system. But then we also got all the other information that lay behind that. So I think that was a good thing. People who are more traumatized, underrepresented for sure. I mean, a lot of people by 5-7 months in did not want to think or talk to anybody about this, did not want to regale their stories again. So I think we didn't get some of those. But a number of the people we spoke to spoke about the broader community, spoke about the older person down the road that they were concerned about and what experience they've had, spoke about other people, spoke about people with children, those sorts of things. So I think we picked up some of that stuff that was missing in that. Again, we were doing these interviews and the survey in English, so we know we've got underrepresentation of cold communities. Absolutely, we've got underrepresentation of Indigenous First Nations people in there as well. We do have some people in our mix from both of those groups, but probably underrepresented generally.
And there's a question in the Q&A from Deb Parkinson. I think it refers to your 5th slide, where there's a lovely photo there of looks like a land subdivision that's underwater. Are they going to rethink that subdivision now? Do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think it was just an ad, a marketing sort of billboard that was probably off the road somewhere, in a ditch. But I don't know. But there is a sort of an irony in that, which kind of makes me sort of smile a bit at the time. But you'd hope that, well, we know there is a lot of pressure on the planning processes now, or there's talk of that. How effective that is. I live in northwest Sydney, and there's a lot of development around me on floodplains, so I'm a little bit skeptical about what it will do for the future, and of course it doesn't help us with the legacy. So
okay, perhaps we go back into.
Do you think I should press on, David?
Yeah, go for it.
I think I probably should. I see that I've got 25 minutes and quite a lot to get through, so I shall talk a bit quicker and carry on if I may. Okay, so third chunk, information needs. So I really liked this question. So it was asking about what was the priority information required, what were the priority information requirements for the community before, during, after the floods. So this gave me a nice opportunity to look at across the timeline a little bit more. And I thought of 2 different ways to get insights in this area. I mean, one is from what people said that they wanted or needed, and the other is from the conversations and the information we have about the problems and the challenges and the things that people didn't get. So I'm relying on sort of both of those sorts of approaches there. So what did people need before? And for those of you who want more information, there's more of this, I think, in the report, so you can find it there. I think in our sample, in both types of data we collected, we've got 2 groups of people. We've got people who had been flooded previously, and we know from the survey that was about 66% of the sample had previous flood experience, either multiple flood experiences or prior flood experiences further back in time. And so they were really, they were engaged in flood. They were sort of aware of their risk, where they weren't complacent in this sort of context. They weren't without knowledge and information. They weren't without interest. But we did have groups of people in there who had not been flooded before, and some people have been in their homes for 20, 30 years. And this speaks obviously to the severity and the differences about these floods. And for a lot of those people, they just weren't aware. They weren't aware of the risk, and they didn't understand the flood risk, even if they'd looked at information. So what we found, in our survey, we asked about whether what people's, before this flooding occurred, what they felt the likelihood was of flooding impacting their properties. And we found, again, for these 2 groups, very different sort of data, as you'd expect. So those people who've not been flooded previously, as I've just said, renters in particular stood out as being different from homeowners here as well. And those people with no flood insurance. And of course, we found people that had lived in these areas for 10, 20, 30 years didn't have flood insurance because they were told they didn't need it. So, really frustrating for those. And of course, people in areas that had flooded previously who couldn't afford the premiums and couldn't afford insurance and didn't have it either. So we found that, that was one of the issues we had in that sort of first group. We also found from those people we spoke to, and to some extent in the survey too, that there was quite a lot of frustration about the lack of accurate flood data, whether that was council flood maps and access to that information. So it being quite difficult to get your hands on. You had to sort of turn up at to get that information. It was hidden, didn't seem to be very easy to access, and people didn't often think that it was reliable either, or hadn't been updated for a long time. So I think when it came to other things about those priority information beforehand, so before, I'm going to talk about preparedness in a minute, so I've come back a bit further in from there. What we were finding that people were talking about planning for flooding and not actually being able to access that information, being frustrated that they weren't told about the flood risks when they'd sort of taken on a rental agreement or bought a property. So a lot of conversations there about requiring real estate agents to provide that sort of information. We found that, for those people who looked for this information, we have the issue that we know exists here, that a lot of this information is hard to actually translate to your own personal situation. So we have issues at one level around that sort of acceptance of risk at a personal level, but also that translation of the information, the data that's available to the personal situation of the individual. So, knowing what the height is at the water, at the river gauge, how does that translate to my property? How does that translate to how things are happening? How does that impact on things like, is that impacted by things like tides and for those people in coastal areas, a whole heap of other areas, other things there that add to that sort of complexity in terms of interpreting information. We've got things like flood terminology. And again, I know there's been quite a lot of chat about that in terms of wanting different ways to talk about probability of flooding, and the 1 in 100, we came across a number of examples of misunderstanding there. So again, we've got that sort of information was really the sort of priority stuff ahead of time. And a lot of call, you can see in the photograph there, for more of these sort of visual reminders in the landscape of the flood heights and the fact that floods can occur and things like that. I know there's been quite a lot of that campaigning sort of in my local area in Hawkesbury, but this picture here is from Lismore again, and they've added the 2022 flood marker up there, and you can see, the extent and how extreme that is. In terms of priority information during the flood, again, a lot of information here, as you'd expect, in terms of what people expected. So what we found in a general sense was there were really high expectations for information during flooding. People were really after very hyper localized information. They needed it to be personally relevant, or as relevant as possible to their context, and it needed to be timely. So we found that we were getting, people were complaining about information because it was too general and they couldn't actually interpret it locally, that it didn't seem relevant to them, or that it was just late. So we had issues around, especially some of the disaster dashboards perhaps not being updated as quickly as they could be. So of course people were turning to social media and other places to find that information. In the survey we asked about people being able to use the information that they received, and I just picked this particular question out, which asked about for those people who received an evacuation warning, did it come with enough time for them to take action? And so this is only for those people that received a warning, so the not applicables are taking out of that. And we found that almost 60% of people here are saying by the time they became aware of this, that it was too late for them to do much with it. So, we were finding issues around that. And of course, people who had less time to prepare, probably in more severe flood situations, and were struggling. And I think the timing thing is really critical here, because we did find in the survey, 61% of people didn't leave during the floods. And obviously some of them didn't have as large impacts, but 61% overall didn't leave, and almost half, or just over half of those people said they didn't leave because by the time they looked to try and leave, they were unable to leave. They were either trapped because roads were cut off, or they couldn't get out for whatever reason. And so of course these high expectations that the community has of the warnings and information are really tricky for us, especially when we have such wide scale events like the floods that we're talking about here. So there are issues around sort of the communications infrastructure, information. There's concerns here about the capacity, to actually provide that sort of information, and then people are very geared up to having that sort of live information through apps, live traffic and those sorts of things. So I think we are sort of conditioning the public to expect that sort of information quickly and accurately and curated in a way that's relevant to them. So when it came to what people actually wanted and were using and enjoyed and liked during this sort of event, the live cameras where they were available, you've got the pictures there on the right hand side from the bridge over the Windsor during the flooding. The local social media was, of course, a good place for people to go for that relevant content and up-to-date information. They wanted that information because they wanted to use it to make decisions. So they were going to it to get another source of information, to confirm or otherwise what other people had said to them. It was assisting in terms of working out the timing, when they're going to go. It gave them opportunity to sort of ground truth some of what they were hearing. So it served a lot of purposes during the event. These things were really, I think, pretty important. In terms of afterwards, again, I think as a team, we found this sort of these discussions really interesting because people had been through the clear up, and we were finding that people were, really wanting information about cleanup advice, about the recovery support that was available, and about insurance claims. So, and I've put in the slide here, a lot of individuals were really quite traumatized. They've been through, some horrendous experiences. They've been they'd lost a sense of security. They may have lost their homes and been very transient. And so people weren't functioning at their best at this point in time. So they really needed support in a whole lot of different areas. So then very briefly, wanted to know about what could be saved. We had a lot of people who'd had time to grieve what they'd lost, to get frustrated about what they'd let go, to wish they still had kept things they could have saved because things were more expensive, the insurance didn't cover things if they had it. So, wanting to know more about what they could have saved, and wanting to know a bit more about the timing of things being taken away by local council in particular. So, just to stop that sort of, I guess, that urgency, or to enable them to make some decisions about how urgently they needed to deal with things, because there was a sense of chuck everything out and people turning up and chucking everything out for them, and then having that sort of repent at leisure kind of situation where they were upset about what had let go. In the recovery support, of course, had a claim for things, so a whole heap of issues there about wanting to sort of get that assistance. And then in insurance, about providing evidence, them not wanting to negate their cover, how to document the losses, and wanting to make decisions to reduce losses during the early stages post-flood. So I've put the picture up here of the mould because that was often mentioned, that people wanted to take the gyprock off the walls, up to a certain point quickly before the water crept up and actually did more damage and things like that. Just getting those answers was difficult because there was stop here, but I'm not going to stop here, David, if that's okay, because I think I want to just get through some of the other questions before we run out of time. So I just really wanted to, I guess, I love this picture with the kelpies on the lounge island here with a few inches of flood water all around them, but taking refuge. So I'll carry on, David, if that's okay.
That's fine, Mel. You got about 20 minutes.
Okay, cool. So I just wanted to answer some of these questions about preparedness. So we had quite a lot of questions come through around preparedness. So, what insights could we glean from the data there? What did the community do? What helped? And what would people do differently? And so we just wanted to try and address some of that in these next few slides. So I know there's a lot of information here, and it's probably going to not be up on the screen for as long as I would have liked. But this is just giving you an indication from the survey about what preparedness actions people said they did during the floods. And of course, bear in mind here again, we've got people here who have been through floods before. So, in some ways I look at the data here and I go, wow, that's a lot of, there's a high proportions of people that saying they did these things. So, but people have been through floods before. Some people had much longer to prepare and do things. And of course, those people did more things. So, in the survey data, we've looked at the amount of time people had before to take action. And of course, people who had more time did more. We looked at people who had been through floods previously. And of course, those who had also did more because they kind of knew what to do and they perhaps got going a bit quicker. So this gives you a bit of a rundown of some of those things people did. So you can see a lot of charging up of phones, a lot of moving stuff, whether that was moving vehicles, whether it's moving possessions higher up, raising them up, moving animals, pumps, things like that. Sandbags, I was quite interested and intrigued by. Only 8% of people put sandbags over drains and toilet bowls. Having seen the advantages of that, I thought that was definitely something people would do a bit more of. But then also sort of stocking up with food and things like that. So we were seeing a lot of different behaviours here in terms of what people actually did. In terms of what we might find out from the data, so I looked at who was more or less prepared to try and get some insights there, and also some of the reasons for not preparing, again, to try and sort of give a bit more information. So as I said before, 67% of people in the sample of our survey had actually been through flooding previously. And when we asked people about how well they felt they were prepared when the floods actually hit, around 30% reckoned that they had done as much as they could in the time that they had. So, people had generally done a lot when they could. And of course, I've already said people who had higher levels of preparedness also, had more time and had more experience. So that was a pretty solid sort of finding there. When we asked people about why they hadn't prepared, you can see time is coming in here as the major factor. Some people literally woke up with their hands in water, whereas others had a little bit more lead in, but we didn't have the same sorts of lead in time as we've seen in other flooding inland in more recent times, where there's been sort of days or weeks ahead of time to actually sort of get going with things. Intriguingly, people, 19% of people in the sample said they didn't know what to do, and of course that's a gap and something that we can look to see, what we can do to make that sort of information more available or help people to think about that. And of course, as I said, we've got people here who haven't been flooded before, probably never thought about it and didn't necessarily know what they could do. Some people weren't at home, and of course that was another issue for them. And then we have other issues here. So, not being physically fit enough to be able to do some of this. So a lot of this flood preparedness involves lifting and pulling things up. And of course, some people weren't able to do that for various reasons. Other people were struggling because they just didn't feel emotionally or mentally kind of able to think things through at that point in time. So as you can imagine, quite a lot of disorganized thinking, probably some unproductive kind of activities going on there and not doing as much as they felt they could. And other people having other commitments, so children, neighbours, elderly, animals, those sorts of things also came into this as well. We asked 5% of people also said that they did other things, so I just had a quick look at that to see what other reasons there were here. And they came down to everything from more of those cognitive things, so underestimating the risks that they had, they didn't feel they needed to prepare, and it was too late when they did, through to a lack of awareness, and then of course the more of these issues to do with limitations that people had for various reasons, but then also of course the reassurances that people were getting from neighbours and others around them, the obvious things you can think of, like oh, it's not going to be as bad as it was in, I don't think it'll get to this point, that sort of stuff. Some of those reassurances were well placed, but in many situations they slowed down or put people off actually doing stuff. So there were some issues there that I think were problematic. In terms of what people do differently, again, I was so excited to get an opportunity to get to some of this information, because one thing we did in the interviews, because you can imagine that some of these were quite sort of traumatic, and some of them we did on the phone and things like that, and we were concerned about how we were leaving people at the end. So we thought quite a lot about how we were going to end these sorts of interviews. And so we often ended with a question which was something along the lines of, having been through what you've been through and acknowledging that, is there anything you've learned that you'd like to about yourself that you think is useful for you, or anything you've learned that you think would be useful for other people who find themselves in a similar situation? So it turned it around to being something where they could actually help other people through their experiences, which of course was motivation for people too. And the one thing that people said more often than not was be more prepared. So that was the kind of the top level, be more prepared. But then when we asked people about other things they would do differently in this preparedness phase, in particular, act sooner. So, moving thing, we found that people were lifting things, raising things up when they realized that flooding was going to impact them, and they ended up staying because they realized it was getting worse. So they kind of almost got into the mindset of, oh, you know, I'll lift it up, I'll lift it up a bit more, I'll lift it up a bit more. And of course that was okay for a lot of people, but for some people that caught them out. You know, leave sooner, and then, you know, that's partly because I've already mentioned people felt they were either, the roads were cut off, they were trapped, you know, there'd been some very upsetting and distressing experiences that people had as a consequence of not getting out sort of sooner, either because they'd left late and had gone through a lot of water, you know, people with children, people who couldn't swim, a whole heap of issues there, why people were sort of really advising people to get out quickly, and avoiding those unsafe acts. So there were, you know, issues around, again, late evacuation here. I liked this one, fill up the car, not so much with petrol this time, but actually with things. So a few times we talked to people and they said, oh yeah, you know, when we thought the floods were coming, we decided we moved one of the cars up the hill. And then they'd sort of talk about it and say, yeah, if we'd actually realized we were going to be flooded as badly as we would have put stuff in the car before we moved it, because then they found they only had one car, or they didn't have a car, and they, you know, had to move stuff by hand, and people were going backwards and forwards through water, etc. So not great. So fill up the car if you're going to move it. Save useful stuff. I like this one. I remember talking to this particular lady I'm thinking of now, and she said that when it came to sort of taking stuff, she grabbed her expensive, I can't remember what it was now, but an item of clothing, something she really liked, and sort of stilettos, her favorite sort of, you know, fancy shoes and the good stuff. And then of course when it came to the after, or the clear up, you know, what she really needed was that scrappy old pair of jeans she had, and the gum boots and things like that. So, you know, yeah, save the useful stuff, not the expensive stuff. Move animals, you know, ahead of time, relocate them if you can, especially horses. Yeah, if you know me, you know that I'm really into all of the animal stuff. So, you know, some very distressing situations for people with horses, and I won't go into that, but you know, they really wanted that information known. And I like this one again, another animal one. Spoke to a few people who stayed in their homes during the flooding, and of course then it took a while for the floods to go down. Particularly these were people who lived in flood modified houses, so they often had outdoor balconies upstairs. And they said, we wish we'd trained the dog to pee on some artificial turf, because the poor dogs were walking around with their legs crossed for days afterwards, because they couldn't find a place to sort of go. So yeah, that was that little gem there. So I thought I'd pass it on. I'm carrying on, whizzing on now. Most helpful advice and action. I really liked this one. I didn't know that I was going to be able to address it particularly well, but I've done my best. So what worked and what didn't work for people, from the perspective of those people who were severely impacted. So I've tried to pick out things that didn't work for those people who were more impacted than others. So again, as you'd expect, very much dependent on the experiences people had had. And so, you know, just picking up on some of those things that didn't work for some people. As I've said, you know, we did speak to people who felt very upset about the official response, the lack of rescue, unable to get through to find out information, very stressful. People had issues to do with the technology and things like that. So clearly that was an issue there. Prior experience has been really interesting, very, very paradoxical. I've got it in this list of things that didn't work and in the list of things that did work. So, you know, prior experience didn't work too well for people because it gave them expectations that then weren't realised. And as I said, you know, a number of residents we spoke to had been through floods previously. They thought they were prepared, but they weren't prepared enough for what they actually encountered this time. So, you know, we had issues there. We had water behaving ways that people said was unusual. You know, it was flowing in a different direction to where it had been before. And then some issues there as well about timing. So, you know, some people had plans and reasonably good flood plans from what they said, but they should have started acting sooner, you know, because things happen much more quickly. So, you know, that prior experience, that reliance on what you know and what you've experienced before was catching some people out. And in some ways similar, other things that didn't work, you know, storm drains, a lot of issues people were having with stormwater versus floodwater, again, partly to do with the timing of our data collection here. But there were issues there around physical structures and changes to the landscape. So, you know, whether it was a highway that had been built that changed the way the water behaved, whether it was the buildings that had been put up nearby, the development, or whatever, issues there that were impacting people and were making it harder for them. In terms of things that did work, again, I've deliberately not talked too much about the community and connectedness, because I could have given you a whole hour on that alone. But community worked well for a lot of people. They were the source of early warnings. They were advice during, neighbours having conversations with neighbours from their balconies during the events. What are you doing? Can I help with this? That sort of stuff. They were the source of local information, on social media and other ways. They were good at alerting rescuers and others to check on people. So they were doing a lot of that. Obviously, rescue community in some certain situations, and they provided reassurance. So community worked really well. In some places, there were local networks already set up. So, community resilience teams were in place in some places. In some places, there were, phone trees working. Some of those neighbourhoods were well known, in the Upper and the McDonald Valley near me here, in Tumbolgan and some of the places, Yukai in the Northern Rivers. Some of those areas, they worked really well. Where there were personal connections with official personnel and agencies, that also seemed to work well for people. Here's the price experience working well as well. So, we know already preparedness of those people who had been impacted before, who had experiences before, that was generally better. They were more engaged, perhaps in the warnings. They'd made more structural modifications to their homes. So whether that was actually, having lift-off doors downstairs, having hard surfaces, installing hoists in businesses and in homes too, to move things up. Whether it was planting differently to try and reduce the impact of landslides, whether it was about drainage and earthworks, those sorts of things were really useful, that people had put in place after they'd been experiencing flood previously in particular. Jet skis and boats, they worked well. A lot of people got out on boats and jet skis or rode out the storm and the flood water, in boats, or evacuated from their homes up their high street in their boat. So a few of those. And I had to put this in because the person who asked the question asked about from the perspective of people who were impacted. It turns out the sheltering in place worked for a lot of people, even though there was lots of bad sides to that, and lots of challenges for people who decided to stay. 79% reckoned that it was the right decision. So I think that in itself is sobering, but information that probably needs to be sort of mentioned as I'm passing. So I guess that's the answer to that question. And then finally, not as much here as I would have liked to have included, but we're nearly up on time anyway, so that's a good thing. We asked this question about what things people wish they'd known before that they know now, and what could have lessened or avoided the resulting situation. So again, it was a big motivation for people to take part in terms of thinking of things that would help them. I like this picture. I'm just going to mention it quickly. A downstairs laundry, not unusual. You can see the person has tried to sort of get their washing machine up off the ground before the flood hit. You can see the water was pretty grotty in there, and you can see the tide mark on those wall units there, and the clothing still in the tumble dryer. Yeah, kind of depressing. So I've already mentioned about being more prepared, and those covers those things I've already mentioned. So try to think of a few more that came up. In the interviews, we found that when things got emotional, it tended to be either to do with people talking about something traumatic, the actual experiences during the flood, or about the help they'd received from people. They were really moved by that. And a number of people said, we learned to sort of say, oh no, we don't need it, someone else is worse off. But people did talk about, learning to accept that help, whether it was charity or whether it was, helpful practical support. So, accept help when it's offered. Be persistent was another thing in terms of, persisting on hold, being persistent about sort of getting answers about things, having skills and trades that you could swap with other people. So what we found in some of the areas in particular, people didn't have a lot of money, but what they did have was skills or abilities to help one another. So this particular person I'm thinking of who mentioned this, her husband was a carpenter, and she said, and he was helping out neighbours. People were helping out with looking after children. People were helping out with other things they could do to sort of support people around them, cooking meals, that sort of stuff. So, having some of those things you can trade with other people is useful. Think differently about yourself and your possessions. So you're not the things you own. So quite a few people talked about how the impact that this had on them in terms of the losses actually made them want to look forward to a simpler life where they weren't as bothered about the things they had, and not to be defined by their possessions. or their limitations, I suppose. So a bit of that in there. Take your time with the cleanup. Again, as I've already mentioned, people were regretting things that got thrown away that sometimes they had no say over. So there was a whole heap of issues there for another time. But other people who got things to work well said, basically we put the blokes in the downstairs area to deal with the washing machines and the stuff in the garage, and I took a couple of my friends upstairs, and we, these are the women I'm talking here, very gendered. We took our time and went through the things that mattered, and they picked through things in a slightly more leisurely pace, and they felt that worked really well. And then, take some of those measures on board for that resilient sort of building. So making homes and business more resilient, put some of those fittings in, change some of the things you can change when you get the chance. So those were the sorts of things that people were saying. And I think that kind of wraps it up. Hopefully we've got a few moments for some questions. I do want to just quickly draw attention to the QR code here. It's on the website, you can see. We're just really interested and keen to find out how people are using the information, what they're able to do with it, any challenges with that as well. So if you've got the opportunity, we'd really appreciate that sort of feedback as well, to know how the research is being used. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. We're coming up to time. We may be able to get a quick question or two in. Your presentation actually addressed most of the questions that were submitted earlier, so we're actually clear on that. That's good. There's one that's standing out, though, from a colleague in New Zealand, is asking, after their recent flooding, how transferable are these findings to New Zealand? And maybe we can extend that question for anyone who's not in New South Wales and Queensland, how transferable on that, and how transferable today to non-flood type hazards, fire, cyclone, whatever, storm, whatever?
Great question, especially for a social scientist. So, my answer there would be a lot of it is transferable, because a lot of it is about people and about their decision making, their biases, their ability to prioritize, preparedness over everyday life. So I think that a lot of this is very transferable, or at least you can find analogous sort of situations in some of those other contexts. There were differences, of course, that were to do with water and flood, and there were differences here to do with the jurisdictions, the disaster frameworks, or the names of organisations, or perhaps the responsibilities in some areas. But they were more transferable to rural or urban areas, or humans, or parents, or people with disability, or whatever it happened to be. So I think a lot of this is about people and risk, and
We are out of time now, Mel. That is actually past the top of the hour.
Sorry.
There's a lot in it, and it's thank you for sharing it. Look, we will end it there, and you can address some of the questions maybe offline that people have answered, and you'll see some of those comments coming through as well. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, audience, for everybody for joining in. That was a absolutely enthralling session for the last hour. The recording will be made available on the EMPA website shortly after now, so please check back into that when you can, and please look out for further EMPA webinars coming up. There'll be one more next month, but that'll be the final one for the year. So thank you, Mel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye now.